want to begin by reading out of Isaiah chapter 5. This is a different kind of message for me anyway tonight. But it's something that's been weighing on my mind for a little while, and finally it has come together in the fashion that it has, and I hopefully it'll be a benefit. Isaiah chapter 5. In fact, it may provoke interaction and discussion, which is a good thing if it does that. But I've entitled it Unrighteous Laws of Men, and it's kind of stirred up by some of the things that's been going on in this nation and some of the things that have been in place, unrighteous laws, and the attempt to block the turning of that to actually establish righteous laws. And so I just want to engage with that a little bit this evening. In Isaiah 5, beginning in verse 20, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil." You know, when my younger days, when I would read a verse like that, I would think, well, who would do that? I mean, we're living in a day where that's being done. I mean, boldly being done, you know. I mean, there's no reservation. Who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Just turn everything upside down. Change definitions, the whole 9 yards. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. Woe to men mighty at drinking wine. Woe to men valiant for mixing intoxicating drink. So I'm going to preach on drinking tonight. No, I'm not going there. Who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away justice from the righteous man. Therefore, as the fire devours the stubble and the flame consumes the chaff, so their root will be as rottenness, their blossom will ascend like dust, because they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts, despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. And this seems to be primarily talking to the nation of Israel. Not the heathen nations of the world. I mean, therefore, the anger of the Lord is aroused against His people. He has stretched out His hand against them and stricken them. And the hills trembled. Their carcasses were as refuse in the midst of the streets. For all His anger is not turned away. For all this, His anger is not turned away, but His hand is stretched out still. And I don't take that to mean His hand is stretched out in come to me, but His hand is stretched out in judgment still against the nation for these sins and for the attitude of the people in regards to Him. We're living in a day of unprecedented changes, at least in my lifetime. And I'm speaking of changes in the moral landscape. It seems just about every once generally accepted moral absolute, and we live in a country where once upon a time there were generally accepted moral absolutes. There was a general regard for God in this country. But now it's all being called into question. There's a growing public acceptance of that which once existed only in the shadows, or we used to call it in the closet. You know, there is no coming out of the closet anymore. There's no closet. Nothing's hidden anymore. Nobody's ashamed of anything anymore. And I really have not said much from this pulpit regarding things like abortion, same-sex marriage, and I have to read this one because I get confused, LGBTQ plus, because it's never ending. Or things like that. I just haven't said much. I haven't railed on it. I haven't preached on it. Why haven't I? Because it seems so obvious to me that these are offenses to God. Why do I need to tell you that they are offenses to God who created us and established human order? You know that. So I haven't felt like I've really needed to harp on those things. I've heard preachers say things like, if you're not preaching against abortion, something's wrong with you. What are you preaching? You know abortion is wrong. You know LGBTQ plus is contrary to the will of God. And while it would be nice to be able to say, the world is the world, and so we shouldn't be surprised what we see in that arena, believe it or not, and maybe you know more than I do, but believe it or not, there is a growing voice within what is called faith communities to support open ungodliness and lawlessness. And when I say lawlessness, I mean by that which is contrary to God's standard of righteousness. God's standard. In an article, I read several articles, and this is from a publication called The Hill. Maybe it's an online publication, I don't know. That's where I found it. And in it, the president of a seminary, it's a liberal seminary called Union Theological Seminary, but it's a respected seminary as the world goes. But the president of that seminary, along with someone else, I forget the person's title, responded to the recent Supreme Court leak of a drafty majority opinion, a draft majority opinion that hinted at overturning Roe versus Wade. And y'all, I think if you've listened to the news, you know all about that. Much was made of it. These guys are responding, referring to far-right Christian leaders, as they call them. The article states, and this is amazing to me, as with abortion, these faith leaders, referring to the far-right Christian leaders, and by the way, they named one, I think this was the article in which one of them was named, Franklin Graham was one of the names that they put out there as a far-right Christian leader. As with abortion, these faith leaders are using a fundamentally twisted interpretation of the Bible. So these people aren't denying the Bible. But they're saying the far-right Christian leaders have a twisted interpretation of the Bible, and they're using that twisted interpretation to condemn LGBTQ plus people as sinful and work to undermine the protections that community has gained in recent years. Most notably, the right to same-sex marriage guaranteed by the Supreme Court's 2015 Obergefell decision. They go on, as ministers and heads of a seminary that is training the next generation of progressive faith leaders, we are outraged by this blasphemous use of the Bible as a tool of hatred and division. Now, let me just put a parenthesis in here. I don't doubt it at all that there are people that use the Bible for hatred and division. The Bible warns against that. So I don't doubt that. But they're saying those who are standing for the truth of Scripture are doing that. So we are outraged by this blasphemous use of the Bible as a tool of hatred and division and not as one of unity and love. So, brothers and sisters, when we talk about unity and love, that does have to be defined because there are others talking about unity and love, like this seminary president. And we know it is up to faith leaders from all major religious traditions, both in the U.S. and abroad, to fight against those twisting the Word of God to justify bigotry, hatred, and discrimination. Right-wing religious leaders profess that the Bible supports these acts of hatred and division, but they ignore the lesson core to all of the major faiths: love a fellow human as you'd love yourself. And as Hebrews 12:14 notes, and this is phenomenal that they quote this verse, as Hebrews 12:14 notes, strive for peace with everyone. And they quote the rest of it. And for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. They quote the whole verse. Faith leaders have a moral obligation to spread this message of that verse. I'm thinking, that's what we're doing. Without holiness, no man will see the Lord. Yeah, pursue peace with all men is equally important, but it's not peace at any cost. It's not ignoring God in the pursuit of a so-called peace and unity. Faith leaders should be at the forefront of efforts to publicly protest these abominable laws. You know what they're referring to as abominable laws? The Texas law. I mean, thank the Lord for the Texas law and the potential overturn of Roe versus Wade. They're saying that's abominable laws, and rally their congregants to oppose them. Now that's a major voice out there in the faith community. It's not in our community, but I'll guarantee you, if that voice, the larger that voice gets, the more influential that voice gets, the more communities like ours will be affected by it in some way, to some degree. Some among us, maybe not you, maybe not all. Some among us. Another Associated Press article, May 20th, 2022, reported religious backers of abortion rights say God's on their side. Religious backers of abortion rights say God's on their side. We know that Christianity supports freedom, and inherent in freedom is bodily autonomy. Inherent in Christianity is free will. When people talk about the body being a temple of God, you have purview over your body. There's nothing more sacred. That doesn't even make sense. If your body is a temple of God, you aren't the owner. You aren't the master. You aren't the ruler. Not your choice. The idea of the state restricting what a person can do with their own body, this person is saying, is in direct conflict with that. And it's reminiscent of being under someone else's control, of slavery. And so you're hearing them talk about trying to join the idea of slavery with the idea of being anti-abortion, or saying that a woman does not have a choice to kill her unborn baby. Pro-choice mindset. And when I say pro-choice here, I'm not just talking about pro-choice in the arena of abortion. I'm talking about pro-choice in the arena of life. You know, pro-choice in reference to whether you want to be a male or female, pro-choice whether you want to marry a male or female, pro-choice. Pro-choice covers a whole gamut of decisions in life. The pro-choice mindset essentially says you have the right to make sinful choices. And if someone says otherwise, including God, they are crossing the line of your freedom. And your freedom is sovereign. Your freedom is what's most important. Now, I know I'm speaking to the choir tonight, but that's not the mind of one who is not her own, not his own. Having been bought with a price and is now led by the Spirit of Christ, we're slaves. We are slaves, aren't we? We're servants, we're slaves to righteousness, Romans chapter 6. We aren't free. We gave up that freedom. We gave up that pro-choice, freedom of choice, when we were arrested by the sovereign grace of God and His Spirit came into our life. We yielded, right? And that's the life of the Christian, yielding to Him in everything. But there is an all-out assault. And I say this because these people are calling themselves Christians. There's one article that I quoted from right there. You read these counselors are in these centers where they do the abortions, and they take their Bibles with them in there in order to counsel these women who have had abortions, in order to help them, and they do it from the Bible. And they are saying that God is on their side. That's the point. That was the point of the article. And I'm not talking here, I'm not trying just to stir up emotion here. I'm trying to be reasonable about this as we think through this. But there is an all-out assault in this generation against God. And is expressed in attempts to do away with laws that govern life according to His clear revelation in His Word. Laws of men may be unrighteous. Okay, so let's start there. The laws of men, of governments, may be unrighteous. All laws established by governments are not necessarily right. You would think, this is why we do the Supreme Court thing. Well, if the Supreme Court says it, there's law, it's right. I mean, the Supreme Court said so, right? The Supreme Court is not the final authority. And yet, just because you or I do not agree or like a law doesn't make it unrighteous. And that's important to keep in mind as well. In other words, I nor are you the determining factor of what's righteous or what is unrighteous. So if we are submitting ourselves to God as we should be as Christians, when the government that we live under makes laws that do not contradict the law of God, it's a law that we submit ourselves to the governing authorities. I am quite sure that I can drive very safely when I get on this interstate out here all the way to at least 410. Well, maybe not quite 410. Maybe 181. Okay? I think I can drive safely at about 85. I think I can. But the government says, what is it? Is it 70 out there? I don't know. Okay, 70. See, I don't even look. No, I go 70. Thereabouts. Okay? No, 70. That's the law. And just because I don't think it's necessarily the best or maybe even right, doesn't make it unrighteous. And so I obey. And you can apply that to other car registrations or all the taxes that we have to pay and the amount we have to pay and property restrictions and et cetera, et cetera. We can get all kinds of worked up over these things. And there are other things we could add to the list, and we could say we don't like them. And it's okay not to like them, but if it's The government has established it as law. Our responsibility is to submit to the laws of the land. So just not liking it doesn't make it unrighteous. Unrighteous laws include those that violate the clear mandates of God in Scripture. Let me give you a few examples. And so a law that affirms marriage to be other than between man and a woman is unrighteous. It always will be. It never will be anything other than unrighteous. No government can establish a law like that we are bound to acknowledge and even support. A law that affirms someone's claim to be what they are not is an unrighteous law. A biological man or a biological woman is always what they are. It can never be anything else but that, no matter what the government says, no matter what science says, no matter what anybody else says. Of course, science can't say anything else, right? I mean, if science is honest, am I right? I'm not a scientist, but some of you guys are. I mean, if we're going to let science, the president likes to say, I follow science, I follow science. Well, follow science. All right? A law that permits drunkenness is unrighteous. People say, well, the law doesn't forbid. What is it in Texas? 21? So 21, I mean, what's the first thing lots of 21-year-olds like to do? Well, they do it before that, but they celebrate it at 21. They get drunk because the law says it's okay. Well, no, it's not okay. That's an unrighteous law. Sexual immorality is unrighteous, no matter what the law says. The law does not, it's okay to fill in the blank. No, that's unrighteous. A law that gives a woman a choice to kill her unborn baby is unrighteous. Now, I watched a documentary on Norma McCorvey. Do y'all know who Norma McCorvey is? Do you know who Jane Roe is? That's Norma McCorvey. Did you know that Jane Roe versus Wade? Did you know that Jane Roe, Norma McCorvey, had 3 children? She did not have an abortion. Now, she wanted to. And it's a sad story. And I don't even want to talk about that too much because for maybe more than one reason, but it's a sad story. That woman was used. That woman was abused. By the way, not only by the proponents of abortion, but by the proponents of anti-abortion. And I can get my blood boiling a little bit over those people who used her in the anti-abortion movement up until whatever, I forget the date, into the 2000s. She was on their side, but she was on the payroll. And she was not, anyway, I'm not going to get into all of that. I'm just saying it's a disgusting situation. She was not a Christian. She claimed to be. In fact, one of the leaders in that movement, the anti-abortion movement, baptized her, et cetera, and made all kinds of claims about her that just simply are not true. And you can hear it in her own words. But what she argued was, women are going to have abortions, so it needs to be done safely. And this is when she became the name Jane Roe. Nobody knew her real name, but until she made it known, they weren't going to make it known. She's the one who made it known. But her case was the case that allowed for women then to have abortions. It was actually in Texas where that all took place. And it has been argued, not only by Norma McCorvey, but by others, that women are going to abort unwanted babies. That didn't just start, by the way. That's been going on a long time. You can go back to the Roman culture. Even in the New Testament time, which is interesting to me. You don't read anything about it in the Scriptures, but it was a common thing in the Roman society. But their argument is we need to make it safe and not force women to engage in undercover or dangerous measures. And there may be some sympathy for that idea. But my question is, where's that logic going to end? I mean, people are going to do a lot of things that are wrong and even harmful. I mean, they're going to do it, whether you have laws against it or not. So, like drugs and sexual immorality, stealing. I mean, there's a lot of things. Murder. There's a lot of things. People are going to do it, no matter what laws you put on the books. So should we change the laws? Should we accommodate with laws that permit and protect such activity so it can be safely done? And I would argue that that's not justice. Who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away justice from the righteous man. It was one of the indictments of Yahweh against Israel. No, that's injustice. That's anarchy. And God takes note of those things. God takes note of unrighteous laws. We cannot resort to just human reasoning or philosophical reasoning or the greater or less of whatever. We can't, when it comes to making laws, they must be righteous laws. And righteous laws are made when you listen to God, the righteous God. Societies that establish unrighteous laws will come under His judgment in the course of history, which has, in fact, history, I think, has proven this, particularly in the day of judgment. Psalm 96, verses 10 through 13. Say among the nations, the Lord reigns. The world also is firmly established. It shall not be moved. He shall judge the peoples righteously. Let the heavens rejoice and let the earth be glad. Let the sea roar in all its fullness. Let the field be joyful in all that is in it. Then all the trees of the woods will rejoice before the Lord, for He is coming. For He is coming to judge the earth. He shall judge the world with righteousness and the peoples with His truth. It's interesting that the wording of the psalmist there, let the field be joyful, trees of the woods rejoice before the Lord. It's almost like, you know what's happening with the fields and the trees and the woods right now? You know what's happening? You know what's happening to the whole earth right now? The whole earth is groaning, according to Romans chapter 8. Groaning. And it's because of the unrighteousness of humanity. Until the day when Jesus does come, the righteous judge, and sets everything right. And that's kind of the picture I get when I read that psalm. The trees of the woods and the fields and the seas. It's like, hurry up. Well, I think we understand that there are unrighteous laws that men make, and we cannot. How should we respond? How should Christians respond to unrighteous laws in our country? And maybe you won't agree with everything I'm saying here, but I'm going to give you what I've got. And first I'll say this, that not all unrighteous laws affect us directly. Okay? I mean, I think there's an indirect impact of unrighteous laws on the whole culture. But directly I'm talking about. In other words, for example, we don't participate in legalized, at least I hope you don't, participate in legalized immorality. I mean, the laws may permit it, but it doesn't affect you because you're following a higher law. You're following the law of King Jesus, right? You're following the law of the kingdom that we're in. you're not going to participate in an abortion or ungodly unions called marriages. So regardless of what the laws may be on those things, they don't really affect us directly in that we're not being forced to do those things. I'm not being forced to. Now, someday they may come and say, hey, preacher, you're going to be a preacher. You're going to have to marry whoever. And if that happens, I'm going to be put to the test. And so will you. And so when unrighteous laws are forced upon us, or if we're being forced to support them, and that may happen in a number of different ways. If someone says that I cannot say that homosexuality is a sin, or I will be guilty of hate crime, then what must I do? I must keep saying homosexuality is a sin. I must keep doing that. Likewise with any other unrighteous law that this country may put into place, because we obey God rather than man. But we must be willing to suffer the consequences, and I would say we must be willing to suffer the consequences as breakers of these laws without complaining. Maybe that's overstating it, because there is a measure of complaint that you can have, but when we break an unrighteous law, we know there are consequences. There very well may be consequences to breaking an unrighteous law. And we need to think about that, count the cost. In our country, I'm trying to answer the question, how should we respond to unrighteous laws? In our country, and this isn't the way it is around the world, in every country, but in our country or through history, we have the privilege as individual citizens to pressure our legislature to establish righteous laws. And the president doesn't establish those. It's the legislature that does that. And we have the responsibility, the privilege and responsibility to be engaged at that level. And we can overturn unrighteous ones, which may be what is in the process right now of happening. And so it's reasonable that we work within our government system to promote what is righteous in these ways. There's a principle that has proven true in history, and it's in Proverbs 14, verse 34. What is it that exalts a nation? You know, I used to refer to that quite a lot in my younger days, not necessarily in preaching maybe, but just in my thinking. I've almost forgotten about that verse. And I need to remind myself about that verse. And we need to remind ourselves about that verse. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And one of the reasons maybe we kind of let verses like that slide is that sin is not a reproach. Not in the sense of people are not ashamed. You can name their sin and they fight right back. But it doesn't matter what people think or feel. It is still true that sin is a reproach to any people. It's true. And righteousness is what exalts a nation. And so it's really in our nation's best interest to promote righteousness. And it's in our best interest to be a part of that promotion of righteousness in our nation. It's not a selfish thing. It's not just about me. It is about the nation. It's about the glory of God. But the nation is affected in a positive way. So we can vote, and we should support legislators who understand God's standard of right and wrong. What should we do as Christians? When unrighteous laws are passed, what should we do? Well, I don't know if doing is the first thing. I think maybe feeling is the first thing. I think it should affect us. It should cause a measure of grief as well as anger in us when unrighteous laws are on the books. But when unrighteous laws get on the book, oftentimes they stay there. We get used to them, accustomed to them. We forget about them. There's the initial shock, and then we move on with life. But I think we need to have a measure of grief and anger in us. Even in King David's life, in a kingdom in which God's law was the rule, there was rebellion. And David reacted to it. Let me read a couple of verses here. Psalm 119, David's reaction to the unrighteous, the relationship of sin going against the law of God. In Psalm 119:53, which was the law of the land. So we're talking here about the law of the land here. He says in verse 53, indignation has taken hold of me because of the wicked who forsake your law. The King James, verse 53, the New King James says, indignation has taken hold of me. The King James says, horror has taken hold of me. Horror. Because of the wicked who forsake your law. So when unrighteous laws are passed in this country, it ought to stir us up with indignation or horror. Look at verse 136. Rivers of water run down from my eyes because men do not keep your law. Rivers of water run down from my eyes. That's not anger there. That's grief. That's sorrow. 158. I see the treacherous and am disgusted. The Old King James says grieved. I see the treacherous and am grieved. I'm disgusted because they do not keep your word. These are reactions of the people of God, of David, a child of God, and of us as the children of God today, and to unrighteous laws. The celebrating of unrighteous laws. Listen, the celebrating of Roe v. Wade ought to bother us. It really should. By the way, I don't think that's the bullseye of our lives or the target or what we should be aiming at in our lives. But it ought to grieve us. It ought to affect us. It hasn't me as much as it should. Psalm 119, 126, here's another reaction. It's time for you to act, O Lord. For they have regarded your law as void or vain. Or another translation says broken. They just disregarded you, essentially. Listen, when you disregard God's law, you disregard God. That's what you're doing. You're disregarding Him. And so the psalmist says it's time for you to act. Well, should we respond with less grief, sorrow, righteous anger, and even calling upon God to act? Well, we should pray for those making the law, shouldn't we? 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 and 2, therefore I exhort, first of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. So pray for those in authority, those who are, even right now, those who are grappling with this whole possibility of overturning an unrighteous law. We should be praying for those who are in authority. We should be respectful, even toward authorities who make unrighteous laws. This may be a little tricky. I believe it's biblical. We should be respectful, even toward authorities who make unrighteous laws. Listen, vengeance is God's. He's going to repay. It's not ours. I doubt the Roman emperors implemented all righteous laws. And yet, Peter wrote, honor the king in his day. We must disagree, but we should do so respectfully. By the way, that's true in any, we call it chain of command, order of authority that God has established. There's nothing sinful about disagreeing, but there is something sinful about disagreeing disrespectfully. I remembered Paul before the authorities in Acts 26. It was interesting the way he communicated with the authorities. What's that? Well, that's not the one that I picked out, but he backed off of that though, didn't he? He did. He apologized for that because it was not right. That's a good example. That's not the one that I thought of. The one I thought of was in chapter 26. Now as he thus made his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you are beside yourself. Much learning is driving you. Imagine you're standing before an authority and he's calling you crazy. But he said, I am not mad, most noble Festus. That was respectful. But speak the words of truth and reason. For the king before whom I also speak freely knows these things. For I am convinced that none of these things escapes his attention, since this thing was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know that you do believe. I mean, I don't think he's being sarcastic. I think he's being respectful. It sounds to me. Then Agrippa said to Paul, you almost persuade me to become a Christian. And Paul doesn't launch off into some sort of demeaning diatribe against King Agrippa. He said, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me today might become both almost and altogether such as I am, except for these chains. He was respectful. I think there are other examples. You remember Daniel? Daniel wasn't disrespectful, but Daniel stuck to what was righteous even when an unrighteous law was implemented. But he wasn't disrespectful. In fact, when he was thrown into the lion's den, I read over that. I didn't put the reference down, but you know, when the king came the next day, you know, I mean, it was like, yeah, you jerk, you know, look what you did. No, it was a respectful response to him, you know. God protected me. And of course, it was nice that the king was pulling for him, right? That helped. Should we protest and picket? And I could launch off into a lot of things here that I could say. I didn't join the anti-abortion movement when it was at its ugliest, I would say. I mean, when things like they were bombing facilities and, doing some just absolutely crazy things. I was watching a documentary showing some of those things, and I was thinking, well, wait a minute, was I wrong in not participating in that? I mean, shouldn't I have been willing to have the police cart me off, you know, in cuffs and send me to jail for standing against this? Or, I didn't do that. Did any of y'all do that? I didn't do it. Some of you may not be old enough to remember that, but it still goes on today. There's picketing, there's signs, there's hateful speech, not hate speech, hateful speech, you know, that is hurled at people. And you get into, Avery may be online right now, but he was telling me about downtown. There was the pro-choice or pro-abortion folks were downtown, was it last week? And in a big gathering, and then there were anti-abortion people there. And he said there was more police force that was required than what they had thought they were going to need. And I got to thinking about that as a Christian. Should the way I engage with those that I am violently opposed to, should the way I engage with them stir things up to where a police force is necessary? Now, to be fair, it may be that those anti-abortion folks were being very calm and civil and speaking truth and et cetera, and the other side was causing the problem. You have examples of that in Scripture, right? And Paul had to be kept from going into the arena. I'm not using the right word there, but you remember that. I mean, they were, great is Diana. They wanted to tear him apart. So it could be the other side stirring that up in all fairness. But I don't believe that we as Christians ought to be seeking to stir up a riot. I don't think that's what we ought to be doing. Maybe as citizens we should be protesting and picketing. But I do not believe, this is where some of you may disagree with me, I do not believe that this is, I know it's not the primary calling of the church, but I don't believe it's the calling of the church to do that. The church as a church. I don't see any evidence of that in the New Testament. I don't see any letter to any church in the New Testament where they were being encouraged, listen, you need to go stand in the public place and be against abortion, or abortion existed, or any other kind of thing like that. Maybe I'm missing something, and I don't say that sarcastically. Maybe somebody can show me something that I just haven't seen. But I don't see that to be the charge to the church. Well, what is the solution for society? What is our part? What should we be seeking to establish a theocratic kingdom? Do y'all know what a theocratic kingdom would be? That would be living under the laws of Moses. Like in the land of Canaan. Is that what we should be seeking to establish in this country? A theocratic kingdom. There are those who will say yes to that. There are those who are trying. In fact, they're seeking, they're doing it in smaller towns with the hopes of it spreading. This is really going on in this country. Spreading to where this nation will be under the theocratic kingdom law. Is that what we should be trying to accomplish? Well, brethren, I'm not going to get into a big theological debate about that. I would just simply have you observe this. We have the Old Testament history. Did it work? I mean, did it work? Was righteousness established in the world? Only temporarily. I mean, laws with death penalty didn't keep Israel. I'm talking about the rest of the world, didn't even keep Israel from idolatry and rebellion. I don't see that to be the answer. And again, this is just a surface response here because this gets really deep in the theological discussion here. I'm not going there. Establishing righteous laws is good, and we ought to be for it. We ought to be promoting that. Laws are necessary. Why are laws necessary? Because there are unrighteous people. And to control a society, you've got to have law. You can't exempt a society from law, right? But laws will never change the hearts of men. And so I don't just suggest, this is where I stand. The answer to society's unrighteousness is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Ultimately, put laws in place, righteous laws in place. But our responsibility as the church is to aim for the hearts of people, is to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when His kingdom is established in hearts, cultures change. Why do cultures change? Because His law is written on their hearts. The new covenant. Examples? You remember Agua Caliente? You've heard Andres talk about it perhaps. When he first went there, it was horrible. Husbands, they made money, but they spent their money on alcohol. It was horrific. People weren't married. They just lived together, etc., etc. And as he began to preach the gospel made its way into people's lives. And all of a sudden, men who wasted all of their living on alcohol began to have money to support their family. And they began to care. And there came stability to their homes and then to the village. And there was an impact on the culture of Agua Caliente. But it was by way of the gospel. You've heard Paul Snyder be coming at the end of July to be with us, and Trevor Johnson talk about the Korowai. Same thing. You go over there. They went in there into a culture where a pig was more valuable than a woman, or than a wife. A pig more valuable than a wife. They preached the gospel. And that culture's changing. They began to put clothes on. And they began to it wasn't things that they had to make them do, or they might not have dressed as nicely as you do, or fully covered as you are, but they covered themselves. They went from where they were. It was a change that took place. And it wasn't by way of implementing laws for the villages. It was by way of the gospel. Lives were changed. And so that's the church's place in our culture. Even as we as individual citizens function within the government parameters in the land in which we live in order to see righteous laws put into place and unrighteous laws overturned, as a church, let us be about the primary business of preaching the gospel. I'll say this as we close here. I don't think in my whole life I've ever felt some of the things I've felt as I have felt in recent weeks, actually. We're coming into a season in this country in which some of us are going to be tested in ways maybe we have never known before, and some of it may come in relationship to our families. Now, maybe your family is all from top to bottom just squared away and all in the same, you all think alike, talk alike, eat alike, do alike, everything's alike. It ain't so in a lot of families. I'm going to tell you, the things that are being talked about publicly right now stir up a whole lot of passion. A whole lot of passion. And there are families that will divide. Battle lines are being drawn. And I, for one, am not going to give on some of these things. On righteous law, I'm not going to give. I'm not going to bend. And I hope you won't either. But I want to say this. Let's not make our stand a political matter first. I'll have to say I agree with those who say, I don't know how you can vote for a platform that is for legalizing murder. I don't know how you can vote for. I don't understand that. But I don't want to be that. I don't want that to be the first thing in my engagement with others. I want others to know that my allegiance is to King Jesus, the Savior of sinners. And I want them to know that. And I want to be able to engage them in a way in which they might listen to me as I confront them with their need of a Savior. And you know what? When they come to know the same King that I know, in that relationship as King, all those other things are going to start falling into place, aren't they? And you're going to be on the same side. Not the same political party. That's not the goal. But the same side, the side of righteousness, which is what we as God's people ought to be. Amen?